Navigating the complexities of today's world, well, it can feel a bit overwhelming, can it? Like trying to track a million moving pieces all at once.
Hmm.
Think about it. The goods that show up on our shelves every day, the intricate technology that powers our devices, our critical infrastructure, it's all part of this massive interconnected web. Global commerce, technology.
It really is. And ensuring integrity and trust within that web, it's becoming increasingly critical. And honestly, with just the sheer amount of information flying around, it can feel like overload.
Totally. It's a lot to process. That's exactly where we come in with a deep dive.
That's right. Our mission for this deep dive is really to help you cut through that noise. Unpack what's most important based on the materials you've shared with us.
Yeah.
We're focusing on some absolutely crucial, maybe sometimes overlooked aspects of supply chain integrity. We'll look at everything from, well, the very real human issue of ensuring goods aren't made with forced labor,
Which is huge.
all the way down to securing the actual silicon chips, the foundational stuff essential to modern tech. Think of it as exploring these different but deeply interconnected layers of trust needed in today's global supply chains.
And this whole exploration, it's specifically tailored for you, our listener. It's based entirely on the materials you provided. We're going to dive into the insights held within those pages, pull out the key nuggets, and, talk about why they actually matter. What stands out to you as we go through this? That's what we want you to keep fun in mind.
We're basically here to be your guides through the details you gave us.
Okay. Now, before we really jump in, just a quick word. This deep dive is brought to you by Stonefly. They're leaders in enterprise storage, backup and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions.
That's right. And if you're looking for secure, ransomware-proof storage, Stonefly sells air-gapped and immutable storage solutions. Really cutting-edge stuff for data protection.
Absolutely. To schedule a demo, you can contact them directly at sales@stonefly.com.
Okay, ready to dive in?
Let's do it.
Yeah.
So let's unpack the first major area covered in the materials you shared. It really feels like a pressure cooker situation right now. This significantly increased focus from governments, particularly here in the U.S., on supply chain integrity. And there's a very strong emphasis, it seems, on forced labor and human trafficking.
It's absolutely critical, and as these materials highlight, it's really moved beyond just being a recommended best practice.
Yeah.
It's become a regulatory imperative. The U.S. government is putting considerable resources and attention here. It's driven primarily by serious human rights concerns, of course,
Yeah.
but they also recognize the economic and, frankly, national security implications.
Right. And the pages you provided, they define these core issues with, well, striking clarity. Forced labor is described as work or services individuals are compelled to perform, often under threat, coercion. It can involve things like debt bondage, where workers get trapped by debt they just can't overcome, restrictions on their movement, maybe withholding wages, or even threats against the worker or their family, basically work that isn't freely chosen.
Exactly. And human trafficking, as defined here, is about transporting individuals through force, fraud, or coercion, specifically for labor or other exploitative purposes.
These aren't just abstract ideas, are they? The materials identify them as severe human rights violations. And for companies doing business globally, they carry, well, significant legal liabilities and potentially devastating reputational risks.
And what's particularly fascinating here, and I think a key insight from the materials you shared, is how the U.S. government is operationalizing this focus. The Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, the UFLPA, is specifically highlighted. It's a major pillar of this whole effort.
Yeah.
It targets goods linked to the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, often called the XUAR, in China.
Ah, yes, the UFLPA. This really feels like the most impactful piece of legislation in this space right now, doesn't it? Can you break down the core mechanism behind it as described in the materials?
Sure. So the core of the UFLPA is something called a rebuttable presumption. What this means is the law presumes, just by default, that any goods mined, produced, or manufactured, either wholly or even just in part within the XUAR, well, it presumes they're made with forced labor.
Okay.
And because of that presumption, those goods are immediately prohibited from entering the United States.
So it's effectively assuming guilt unless the importer can prove innocence. Is that a fair way to put it?
In practice, yes, that's pretty much the operational effect.
Yeah.
And the scope of this presumption, as detailed in your materials, it's incredibly broad.
How broad?
Well, it's not just limited to companies physically located in Xinjiang.
Yeah.
It applies if any part, any input, doesn't matter how minor or how far down the supply chain it is if it's sourced from the XUAR.
Wow.
And furthermore, it applies if goods are made by entities that cooperate with the Xinjiang regional government or the XPCC, that's the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps, on specific government programs linked to forced labor. Things like the widely criticized poverty alleviation or pairing assistance programs.
Okay.
And the materials also specifically mention the UFLPA entity list. If you source from a company on that list, the presumption applies too. It's comprehensive.
Wow. Wholly or in part. That means even a tiny, tiny component, maybe several steps removed from the final product, could trigger this whole thing. That dramatically broadens the scope of risk for companies, well, everywhere.
It absolutely does. And the enforcement of this law, as your materials clearly show, it's very real, it's active, and it's increasing. Agencies like U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP, and the Office of Foreign Assets Control, OFAC, they're actively scrutinizing imports based on these concerns.
CBP in particular seems to have significant authority here and is really using it.
They do. CBP has the power to detain goods suspected of being tainted by forced labor. And when they do that, they can issue what are called withhold release orders, or WROs. These effectively stop the goods from entering the country until the importer provides satisfactory evidence, proof really, that the goods are clean.
And the numbers cited in the materials you shared, they're pretty compelling evidence of this active enforcement, aren't they?
They really are. Over 15,500 shipments detained under forced labor statutes, the total value. Over $3 billion. That's a substantial hit to trade flows.
$3 billion. Yeah, that's not insignificant.
Not at all. And certain industries are highlighted in the materials as being particularly impacted. The automotive industry is specifically called out. There's reference to a U.S. Senate Finance Committee report which found that many major automakers had, frankly, failed to adequately vet their complex supply chains for components potentially made with forced labor in China.
Right.
And that report directly led to calls from influential figures like Senate Finance Committee Chair Ron Wyden for, and this is a quote, supercharged enforcement.
Supercharged enforcement. Okay, that certainly doesn't sound like these efforts are going to ease up anytime soon. It signals a kind of escalating risk environment for importers.
It certainly does. But here's where it gets really interesting, and maybe one of the more surprising insights from the UFLPA dashboard data mentioned in your materials.
Oh.
While the law targets goods linked to Xinjiang in China, the most common country listed as the origin for these detentions, it isn't China itself.
It isn't. That is surprising. Where is it then?
The data shows the most common country for detentions is actually Malaysia.
Malaysia.
Followed by Vietnam, then Thailand, then China, then India.
Malaysia. How does that work if the UFLPA is focused on goods linked back to Xinjiang?
Well, this data point is such a critical nugget of knowledge. It highlights that the risk is fundamentally tied to the inputs the components used, not just the direct country of origin of the final manufactured product.
Okay, makes sense.
So a manufacturer in Malaysia might be using components or maybe raw materials that originated in the SUAR, or maybe they came from an entity on that UFLPA entity list. That triggers the presumption, even though the finished product is assembled somewhere else entirely.
That powerfully underscores just how deeply integrated and frankly incredibly complex these global supply chains are, and how far companies need to look beyond just their immediate Tier 1 suppliers.
Exactly. So the clear, unvarnished message from the government, as presented in these materials, it's both stark and simple. Companies sourcing from abroad must take full responsibility, full stop, for ethical sourcing and supply chain integrity throughout their entire supply chain from end to end.
They absolutely need to know where their components come from, right down to the very last sub-supplier.
Precisely. And a crucial point the materials emphasize is that the importer of record, that's you, the company bringing the goods into the country, you are legally responsible. You cannot just rely solely on your customs broker and assume they're handling all aspects of UFLPA compliance or the needed supply chain due diligence. The ultimate legal and financial responsibility, it rests squarely with the importer.
And that rebuttable presumption you mentioned earlier. The materials make it pretty clear that while it's technically possible to rebut it, the standards required, well, they're extraordinarily difficult to meet in practice.
They are very difficult. While you could theoretically try to prove the goods were not made with forced labor, even if there's a link to XUIR, the practical reality, as outlined in these pages, is that importers often need to demonstrate absolutely no link at all to the XUAR or to an entity list company anywhere in the supply chain. That's often the only realistic way to get goods released.
So it puts a really heavy burden on the importer to prove a negative or demonstrate absolute verifiable clean sourcing through exhaustive documentation.
It really does. A very high bar.
Okay, so let's unpack the practical side of this. Given that intense pressure and the difficulty of, rebutting that presumption,
Yeah.
how do companies actually build a system to manage this risk effectively? The materials outline a 6-step compliance program that seems designed to address this challenge head-on.
Yes, this section of the materials gives a really practical roadmap. It frames these 6 steps as absolutely essential for importers who have any exposure, any risk of potential detentions. It's all about building a robust, proactive program, identifying risks, mitigating them effectively, and crucially, being able to demonstrate rigorous due diligence to authorities like CBP if asked.
Step 1 is presented as foundational. Map your supply chain. Seems obvious, but probably harder than it sounds.
Absolutely critical, and yes, often harder than it sounds.
Ah.
You simply cannot manage risks you don't understand or can't see. This step means understanding all the actors involved, not just your direct suppliers, but going down to sub-suppliers and even their sub-suppliers.
Wow.
You need to map out all the transactions, the locations of production, the identities of the entities involved, their business relationships. It's detective work, really.
And this mapping isn't just a one-time exercise, is it? It has to be ongoing.
No, definitely not. It needs to be dynamic, constantly updated. The materials suggest using public resources to estimate risk probability for different raw materials, components, or geographic regions. Stay alert for red flags,
Like what kind of red flags?
like inputs supposedly coming from countries that lack the verifiable production capacity for those specific items. That could strongly indicate undisclosed or unauthorized sub-suppliers are involved somewhere. And crucially, you need to require your direct suppliers to notify you, to update you, whenever they bring a new sub-supplier on board. That way your supply chain map stays current and accurate across all tiers.
That makes perfect sense. You absolutely need that visibility. Okay, step 2 then is conducting due diligence.
Right, so once you have that map, this is where you delve into the specifics.
Yeah.
The due diligence process, as described here, needs to cover a detailed description of the supply chain for the specific goods and their components. This means tracing the flow from raw materials all the way to the finished product being imported.
So, following the thread.
Exactly. You need to identify all the entities involved at each step, understand their roles, and document their relationships clearly.
And is there a heightened level of scrutiny or specific requirements for goods coming from or with inputs from China?
Yes, the materials explicitly note that goods originating from or containing inputs from China are at significantly higher risk under UFLPA. Due diligence for these items requires specific, verifiable evidence to conclusively show there are absolutely no links to the XUAR, to companies on the UFLPA entity list, or any other connection to those XUAR-linked labor programs. The bar is higher.
But it's not just about the UFLPA, correct? The due diligence needs to be broader than only that specific act.
Correct, and this is a really key point. While UFLPA is a major driver of enforcement right now, especially given the volume of detentions, the due diligence process should also look for general indicators of forced labor, regardless of the location. That includes things like evidence of intimidation or threats against workers, restricted movement, maybe they can't leave the workplace freely, abuse of living or working conditions, excessive working hours that violate local laws or international standards, or indications of deception during recruitment.
Okay.
The materials provide a list of the types of evidence needed here, which really gives you a sense of the detail required. Things like the comprehensive supply chain map we discussed, detailed records on wage payments, information about worker residency or status, evidence showing production volume is consistent with the documented number of workers, detailed records on hours worked, and documented proof of voluntary recruitment, and that the work is performed free from coercion or threats.
That is an incredibly detailed level of information to track, especially when you're talking about multiple tiers down the chain, which leads right into step 3, reinforcing this by focusing specifically on extending due diligence to sub-suppliers.
Exactly. Because, as we saw with that surprising Malaysia detention data, liability can arise from any tier in the supply chain, not just your direct suppliers. You absolutely have to identify the provenance, the origin of each component and raw material.
Which sounds challenging.
It often requires working very closely and proactively with your direct suppliers to compel them, essentially, to provide information about who they source from. The materials even suggest using unique identifiers or specific tracking methodologies, especially for things like commingled materials, think cotton or minerals, as a way to try and track specific inputs through the complex chain.
Okay, so you've mapped the chain, you've done the thorough due diligence, pushed that diligence down to the sub-suppliers. Step 4 is about developing legal protections.
Right. This is presented as another necessary layer in your overall compliance program. A vendor code of conduct is identified as a crucial first step. This document basically lays out your legal and contractual obligations for all your suppliers. It needs to explicitly forbid forced labor, human trafficking, and specific violations of UFLPA requirements, like participating in those government labor schemes or using any entity list companies.
And that code of conduct, it needs to be actually integrated into contracts, not just a standalone policy.
Yes, absolutely. You need to incorporate that code of conduct and its requirements into all your contractual agreements with suppliers, not just the big, long-term master agreements, but individual purchase orders too. And critically, include terms that allow you or maybe a designated third party to conduct audits and verification.
Makes sense.
Furthermore, the materials stress the need for flow-down requirements. This is key. Your direct suppliers must be contractually required to push all these same compliance requirements: the vendor code, training obligations, audit rights, reporting responsibilities down to their sub-suppliers. The standards have to cascade all the way down the entire chain, mirroring your own standards.
So the standards cascade down. Okay. Step 5 then is communicate and train. Because policies written down are one thing, but they're pretty useless if nobody understands them or their importance.
Precisely. Training is absolutely essential, both internally and externally. Internally, you need to train your own employees, anyone involved in selecting and managing suppliers. They need to thoroughly understand risk assessment principles, the legal restrictions like UFLPA, the severe consequences of violations, the specifics of that ex-your entity list presumption, and the details of the company's own code of conduct and due diligence procedures.
And externally, does that training need to reach the suppliers themselves?
Yes, you need to clearly communicate these legal and contractual requirements to your suppliers at all tiers. This means providing them with training directly on forced labor, human trafficking risks, and UFLPA issues. Or if that's not feasible for every single entity way down the chain, you need to require your direct suppliers to provide this same level of training to their sub-suppliers, ensuring the knowledge and expectations are really disseminated throughout the supply chain.
Okay. Finally, step 6. Monitor compliance and remediate. This sounds like the ongoing active part of the program, the day-to-day vigilance.
It is. This is the continuous process, monitoring your supplier's compliance with your code of conduct and the legal terms you've set out. If you find issues, any indicators of forced labor or specific UFLPA violations, the guidance in the materials is very clear, very direct. You must cease importing impacted goods immediately.
Stop the shipment, dead in its tracks.
Exactly. If you intend to continue working with that supplier, which may or may not be possible depending on the severity of the issue, you need to develop a specific time-bound corrective action plan.
And if they don't fix it?
If remediation isn't possible, or if the supplier fails to complete it in a timely and verifiable manner, the materials recommend terminating the relationship.
They also suggest considering independent third-party verification, especially for high-risk areas or suppliers, just to assess the effectiveness of your entire diligence system. Get an outside pair of eyes on it.
That 6-step process sounds incredibly rigorous. Resource-intensive, definitely, but clearly absolutely essential in this new, heightened enforcement landscape.
It really does. It reflects the level of detail and accountability that authorities like CBP are now expecting from importers. There's no cutting corners here.
Which naturally brings us to the next section, detailed in the materials you shared. What happens when, despite implementing these rigorous steps, detentions do happen? Handling those CBP reviews. Yeah, this is the unfortunate reality many companies are now facing. As we noted earlier, CBP is significantly emphasizing enforcement, and the materials explicitly state they are not planning to ease up. In fact, they're even adding new high-priority sectors to their enforcement list beyond the initial focus areas. So the strong recommendation is prepare thoroughly before you even think about importing items from potentially high-risk supply chains.
Okay, so the goods are detained at the border. What's the initial step? And often it sounds like the source of significant frustration for importers.
Well, the initial frustration, as noted in the materials, is that CBP doesn't always provide a highly specific, detailed reason for the detention notice right up front. Sometimes it might be obvious, like sourcing from a clearly listed entity, but other times it's less clear-cut and requires some digging.
So you have to figure it out yourself.
Sometimes, yeah. The materials explain that companies often need to research public sources, media reports, publications from NGOs, academic organizations, and analyzed CBP's prior enforcement activity and public data to try and figure out why their specific goods were flagged.
That UFLPA dashboard you mentioned earlier sounds like it would be invaluable in that kind of situation.
Absolutely. The dashboard, which you referenced in your materials, provides filterable statistics by value, country of origin, commodity type, timing. It's a useful tool. And re-examining that surprising finding that Malaysia leads in detentions, followed by Vietnam, Thailand, China, and India, it really highlights that the risk is geographically diverse because of these complex supply chains.
Right.
The dashboard also lists the top commodities facing detentions: electronics, apparel, industrial and manufacturing materials, agricultural products, consumer products, pharmaceuticals, base metals, machinery, and the automotive and aerospace sectors, a wide range.
That's a substantial list of affected goods.
And specific high-risk commodities like cotton, polysilicon, PVC, aluminum, and tomatoes have been under intense scrutiny for a while. Recent reports mentioned in the materials add areas like vinyl flooring and batteries as products of growing concern.
Okay, so once you receive that detention notice, the materials stress that prompt response is absolutely critical, correct. Time is of the essence.
Critically important, the clock starts ticking immediately. You have only 30 days from the date of that notice to either export the goods back out of the country or submit detailed documentation to CBP arguing for their release, disputing the detention.
30 days isn't long.
Not at all, especially given the documentation needed. Contacting the listed CBP point of contact immediately upon receiving the notice is essential. And if you anticipate needing more time to gather everything, you must request an extension well in advance of that 30-day deadline. Don't wait until day 29.
And the materials mentioned a potential advantage for CTTAP partners. What's that about?
Yes. Companies that are members of the Customs Trade Partnership Against Terrorism, or CTPAT, program, they may receive prioritized review of their admissibility packages by CBP. In a situation where time is absolutely critical, that potential prioritization could be a significant benefit, worth looking into if you're not already a member.
Preparing the response package itself seems to be the core, most demanding part of handling a detention.
It absolutely is. While CBP states they look at the totality of information when reviewing a case, the materials you shared strongly stress the importance of following CBP's specific guidelines and their suggested model table of contents for the submission. A complete, accurate, well-organized submission with all supporting documents translated to English is absolutely crucial for facilitating a faster review.
So organization matters. A lot.
Immensely. CBP estimates a review time of around 2-3 weeks for a really well-prepared package, but a disorganized or incomplete submission can significantly extend that timeline.
So basically, make it as easy as possible for them to understand your case and find the information they need.
Exactly. Including a clear executive summary right at the beginning and structuring your submission precisely according to their suggested table of contents will help CBP navigate the information efficiently. The easier it is for them to follow your documented supply chain and compliance efforts, the quicker the potential release resolution.
And what kind of evidence specifically are they looking for in this response package? The materials you provided go into quite a bit of detail here, which is incredibly helpful for anyone facing this.
They do. The evidence requirements are extensive, covering multiple areas. First, detailed information on your overall supply chain. That means a comprehensive description linked directly to your supply chain map, a list of all identified suppliers and sub-suppliers involved in producing the goods in question, complete with contact info documentation outlining each entity's role in the process, affidavits from suppliers if you can get them, all relevant shipment records.
Like purchase orders, packing lists.
Exactly. POs, packing lists, shipping documents, also financial records demonstrating payments made through the supply chain, invoices, receipts, payment records, inventory records to show material flow, and any other relevant import or export records related to the goods or their components.
That sounds like potentially a mountain of documentation just for that first part.
It really is.
Yeah.
You also need to include documentation on your supply chain management measures. This means providing evidence of your internal controls designed to prevent forced labor risks, details on any remediation steps you've already taken to address potential issues in that supply chain, copies of your relevant compliance documents like your vendor code of conduct, and documentation of any recent UFLPA-specific audits related to the suppliers involved in the detained shipment.
Okay. And evidence related to the actual production process itself, the manufacturing side.
Yes, evidence pertaining to the miner, producer, or manufacturer. This includes production records that trace the materials through their manufacturing stages, copies of production orders, reports on factory capacity, and critically, evidence showing that the volume of inputs received by a supplier actually matches the volume of output produced.
Ah, so proving they could have actually made it with the materials they claim to use.
Precisely. It helps verify that the claimed supplier really produced the goods or components in question. You should also include any factory site visit reports, audits you've conducted, or other compliance checks related to the facilities involved. And they specifically state any other relevant evidence that helps demonstrate the good was not made with forced labor. Basically, throw everything you have at it that supports your case.
So you need to provide everything you possibly can. And for those particularly high-risk goods you mentioned earlier, like cotton or polysilicon, what kind of enhanced evidence is required? Is the bar even higher there?
It is. For those high-risk commodities, as identified in the materials, CBP expects enhanced evidence, which goes even deeper. This includes an exceptionally detailed full supply chain map specifically for the goods and their components, tracing them all the way back to the raw material source if possible, especially for items originating in or linked to China.
Wow. Back to the source.
Yes. You also need to provide information on workers at each entity in China involved in producing the goods or components, details like wage payment records, documentation of production output per worker, information on worker residency or status. Crucially, you need to provide specific affirmative evidence showing no connection whatsoever to the XUAR or to any entity on the UFLPA entity list.
Proving a negative again.
Essentially. And if any historical connection existed, you need verifiable proof it has been completely severed. You need documented evidence of voluntary worker recruitment and that the work is performed free from coercion or threats. And finally, you need documentation of credible audits of the facilities and irrefutable proof that any forced labor issues identified were fully remediated and corrected prior to the shipment being exported.
That remediated prior to shipment part seems really significant. It highlights that you can't just promise to fix issues after the fact to get your goods released. The problem must have been resolved before the goods were even sent.
Exactly. It's a critical distinction.
What about confidential business information? Suppliers further down the chain might be reluctant to share sensitive details directly with the importer.
That's a fair point. The materials note that suppliers can submit business proprietary information directly to CBP if they have valid confidentiality concerns. This shows CBP is willing to work with the complexity of these multi-tier supply chains to obtain the necessary information while respecting legitimate business sensitivities. So there is a mechanism for that.
Okay. Even if your goods are eventually released after submitting all this extensive documentation, does that automatically mean you're in the clear for future shipments from the same supply chain? Or could it happen again?
Not necessarily. CBP has stated they may continue to detain future shipments from manufacturers with known or suspected ties to the XUAR until those links are definitively confirmed to be gone and the supply chain is verified as clean. So while you can reference prior clearances in future submissions to potentially streamline things, ongoing scrutiny may definitely occur.
So you need to be prepared for this to be an ongoing process, potentially, for certain supply chains, not just a one-off event.
Right. The material suggests that some proactive importers are now choosing to submit their comprehensive supply chain documentation and UFLPA admissibility information to CBP before the goods even arrive at the border, sometimes as soon as they leave the foreign port.
Proactive submission, does that help?
While it doesn't guarantee immediate release, it can significantly shorten the review time once the shipment physically arrives in the U.S. It sounds like the overarching message here is just you have to be incredibly proactive. Have your documentation processes completely buttoned up, have all that detailed evidence ready long before you ever receive a detention notice. Be prepared.
Absolutely. Because, as highlighted in the materials you shared, the consequences of failing to manage these supply chain risks are severe. We're talking detained goods leading to production shutdowns if you need those components, potentially enormous penalties, significant and long-lasting reputational damage to your brand, and even threats to your ability to import into the U.S. at all. It's clearly no longer just a simple compliance issue. It's a critical aspect of regulatory and operational risk management.
Couldn't agree more. The stakes are very high.
Building on that point about failure, let's talk about why companies sometimes struggle with this. The annex included in your materials lists some common pitfalls and failures in supply chain risk management. It helpfully categorizes them broadly into institutional, resource, regulatory, and execution challenges.
Yeah, it's really useful to look at these common missteps. Learn from where companies often trip up in practice.
Okay, let's go through some of the key failures mentioned. Institutional inertia is listed first. What does that mean here?
Yes, this refers to internal resistance to implementing changes. Maybe a lack of prioritization from senior leadership, or perhaps poor coordination across different departments within the company. Think purchasing, legal, compliance, logistics, not talking to each other effectively.
Right, silos.
Exactly. The key takeaway here, according to the materials, is the absolute need for strong leadership engagement. Educating the C-suite on the very real financial and reputational risks involved is critical. Conducting supply chain and customs audits is suggested as a practical way to identify exposure and really get leadership attention focused on these vulnerabilities.
Okay. Neglecting sub-suppliers is another one that came up repeatedly in the compliance steps, and it's listed as a failure here too.
A very common and, frankly, often catastrophic oversight. Focusing only on your direct suppliers, your tier ones, and having massive blind spots further down the chain. But as we've discussed, liability can come from any tier.
Yeah.
So the crucial takeaway is establishing those cascading compliance systems we talked about, contractually requiring your primary suppliers to not only adhere to your standards themselves, but also to monitor and report on their own suppliers' practices, pushing compliance requirements down through every single level.
Insufficient resources. Sounds pretty basic, but I bet it's a common problem.
It is. Setting ambitious supply chain integrity goals without allocating the necessary budget or the right tools, technology, or maybe even the training needed to achieve them effectively. The takeaway here is pretty straightforward. You need to align your budgets with your supply chain integrity goals and ensure you get management buy-in for these essential investments. You can't do it on the cheap.
Failing to fully map supply chains was also highlighted as a major failure. Seems related to neglecting sub-suppliers.
Yes, very related. Having little to no knowledge of the entities operating beyond that first tier of direct suppliers. The takeaway, really reiterate a point from the compliance steps, is the need for thorough supply chain mapping down to all tiers. Achieve full traceability and accountability. This comprehensive map isn't just a compliance document, it's a crucial tool for actively managing risk day to day.
Over-reliance on contracts alone. What's the issue there?
Assuming that simply having strong terms and conditions in your supplier contracts is sufficient protection. But without ensuring those terms are actually implemented, audited, and enforced on the ground, you are still exposed. The contract is just paper otherwise.
Right.
The takeaway is to supplement those contractual terms with routine risk assessments and audits that actively verify compliance in the field. Boots on the ground, checking things out.
Ignoring red flags. That sounds dangerous.
Very. When questionable practices or inconsistencies pop up in audits or reports, but maybe they're downplayed, dismissed, or not formally investigated, you absolutely need established reporting systems for potential red flags and formal protocols for responding to them swiftly and seriously before they escalate into major compliance violations or worse, detentions.
Skipping risk-based audits.
Yeah, underfunding audit programs, or maybe focusing audit resources only on areas like quality or finance, while neglecting integrity risks like forced labor or UFLPA exposure. The takeaway is adopting a risk-based approach. Strategically focus your audit resources on high-risk areas or vendors, those in problematic geographic regions, or dealing with those high-priority commodities we discussed earlier. This targeted approach helps uncover hidden vulnerabilities much more effectively than random checks.
And finally, a big one directly related to that importer of record responsibility we discussed. Over-reliance on customs brokers.
Yes, believing that your customs broker handles all aspects of import compliance automatically. But the material explicitly clarifies, again, that the importer is the party legally responsible for meeting all U.S. import requirements. That includes supply chain integrity and UFLPA compliance. Detained goods, associated penalties, they directly impact the importer, not the broker.
So the broker isn't your get-out-of-jail-free card.
Not at all. The crucial takeaway is that while customs brokers are invaluable partners, the importer must establish robust internal processes to oversee all import risks, from tariff classification and entry data accuracy all the way to complex supply chain integrity requirements like preventing forced labor. You need to have internal expertise and oversight. Don't abdicate responsibility.
Looking at this comprehensive list of pitfalls, it really circles back and reinforces the core message that seems to permeate the materials you shared, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. The success or failure of navigating this complex landscape fundamentally requires taking full responsibility for the entire supply chain, extending that diligence and oversight all the way down to that very last sub-supplier. You have to actively identify, manage, and mitigate the risks at every single level to ensure both integrity and, frankly, smooth, compliant operations. It's not a one-time box to check. It's a continuous, ongoing process of due diligence, monitoring, and oversight.
Okay, that provides a really thorough look at the physical supply chain and the sort of human element of integrity. Let's transition now to a very different but critically related layer of supply chain integrity, the security and trustworthiness of the silicon chips themselves, especially those that integrate third-party components. This feels like shifting gears quite a bit.
It is a shift, but it's deeply connected to the overall theme of trust and verification in complex systems. This moves us down to the absolute foundational level of modern technology. Secure silicon. It's what powers literally everything today. Consumer electronics, critical infrastructure, data centers, defense systems, you name it.
Right.
And modern chips, often designed as complex systems on chip or SoCs, they're rarely built entirely from scratch by one single company anymore. They frequently integrate third-party intellectual property, or IP. These are pre-designed functional blocks.
Like what kind of block?
Things like cryptographic engines, high-performance processors, specialized sensors, network-on-chip interconnects, hardware roots of trust, all sourced from various specialized vendors located all around the world. It's its own global supply chain, but at the design level.
And integrating that third-party IP clearly has business advantages, right? Things like speed to market, cost reduction.
Yes, absolutely. It allows chip designers to integrate cutting-edge technological advancements relatively quickly, accelerate their development timelines dramatically, reduce expensive R&D costs, and leverage the deep expertise of specialized IP vendors. But, and this is the crucial part highlighted in the materials you shared, this complexity and integration introduce significant security risks into the design supply chain.
How exactly do those risks manifest themselves at the chip level?
Well, third-party IP components are often highly configurable, allowing SoC designers to tailor them to specific applications. While this flexibility is valuable, if it's not properly managed and integrated, it can introduce system-level security vulnerabilities that wouldn't necessarily be present in a simply fully in-house design. Okay.
And what's more, the material notes a really important point. Even if the third-party IP itself is implemented securely by the vendor who designed it, improper integration at the SoC level, or maybe misconfiguration of the IP by the firmware after the chip is produced, that can introduce critical security weaknesses too.
So flaws can be introduced not just by the IP vendor, but also during the design integration stage, or even by the software configuration process later on. It's multi-stage risk.
Exactly. And these types of flaws are notoriously difficult to detect during traditional pre-silicon verification stages, which often focus more on functional correctness, does it do what it's supposed to do, rather than deep security properties.
And finding them after the fact is bad news.
Very bad news. If these vulnerabilities are found after the product is released, after chips are out in the field, addressing hardware vulnerabilities is incredibly expensive. It often requires hardware revisions, new versions of the chip, or complex software workarounds. It can severely damage brand reputation, lead to costly recalls, and really impact market share. So how do you build trust in this complex digital design supply chain? The material you provided talks about the need for transparency, but seems to suggest it goes beyond just simple claims.
Yes, transparency is highlighted as a necessary first step, but it's framed as needing to be more than just, marketing fluff. IP providers need to offer clear, measurable evidence of the security of their IP. This could be documented compliance with relevant industry security standards, or maybe detailed results from rigorous vulnerability testing they've performed. The goal is to provide tangible data to give confidence to the song developers who are integrating this IP into their larger designs.
But as you said, transparency alone isn't necessarily sufficient for truly building trust, especially in security-critical applications. The materials go further.
That's a key insight from the materials, yes. It states that you need verifiable security. This means needing reproducible proof that the IP core is secure, not just taking the vendor's claims at face value. And importantly, you need a formal specification or methodology for how to test its secure integration and configuration within the larger SOC's design.
Ah, so empowering the chip integrators.
Exactly. This empowers the SOC developers to verify both the IP's intended functionality and its security capabilities in their specific environment and configuration, ensuring no new weaknesses were introduced during their part of the design process. It's about enabling verification down the chain.
That's a powerful concept, giving the chip integrators the actual means to verify security themselves rather than just having to trust the IP vendor's word for it. How are they approaching identifying these complex design flaws before the silicon is actually manufactured, before it's too late, basically?
Well, using established standards like the Common Weakness Enumeration, or CWE, which provides a categorized list of common software and hardware weaknesses, is mentioned as a useful guide for systematic analysis during the design phase. And technologies like Security's Radix are introduced as specific tools that leverage security monitors to verify IP integrity.
Security monitors, how does that work?
The idea is the monitor is applied systematically from the individual IP block level up through the integration into the SoC, and then looking at the entire system level. This approach aims to ensure that no new security weaknesses are introduced during the various stages of integration, configuration, or even through incorrect usage by higher-level firmware or software later on. It's about providing traceable and repeatable evidence of security throughout that entire design chain.
Okay, that provides a kind of technical layer of assurance within the chip design process itself. Now, the materials shift gears again slightly to discuss how open source is being leveraged as a potential solution for building trust and transparency in this space, bringing in OpenTitan as a key example.
OpenTitan is indeed presented as a leading example of this open approach. It's described as the first open-source Silicon Root of Trust, or ROT, project.
First open source Silicon ROD.
Yes. And it's not led by a single company. It's stewarded by RISC, which is a not-for-profit organization, and developed collaboratively by a coalition of diverse partners. The materials list some of these key players: Google, ETH, Zurich, Nuvoton, G+D, Mobile Security, Seagate, Western Digital, Revos, Winbond, and also zeroRISC, who we'll talk about more.
Quite a coalition.
It is. Its stated goal is to make the design of silicon roots of trust fundamentally transparent, trustworthy, and secure, precisely because it's open source. The design is available under a permissive license like Apache 2, meaning literally anyone can inspect the design, use it, and even contribute back to it. Open collaboration.
Okay, backing up slightly, what exactly is a root of trust in the context of silicon? Why is it so important?
Think of it as the ultimate security anchor for a system. A root of trust, or ROT, it's typically a small, highly trustworthy hardware component. Its job is to verify the integrity of critical system components, ensuring they boot up securely using only authorized, verified code. It's the foundational element that helps ensure the hardware platform and its basic software remain in a known, trusted state from the very moment the device powers on.
So if the ROT is compromised?
Then the security of the entire system is basically in doubt. It's the bedrock.
Got it. And the materials highlight that OpenTitan has reached a pretty significant milestone recently. Something notable happened.
Yes, a major achievement noted is that OpenTitan is the first open-source silicon project of its kind to reach commercial availability, meaning they have fully validated chips actually in hand.
Wow, that's big for open source hardware.
It is. It's described as the result of intense multi-year collaboration and significant investment by all its coalition partners. The materials mention the discrete Earl Grey chip design, which successfully achieved tape-out, meaning it was ready for manufacturing in mid-2023. And integrated Darjeeling and Chai designs are also progressing. This milestone really demonstrates that the open-source model, which has been incredibly successful for software for decades, can indeed work for complex silicon hardware too.
Yeah.
It's bringing transparency and collaboration to a space traditionally dominated by proprietary closed designs.
That is a big deal, having a commercially available open source silicon root of trust. Opens up possibilities.
It really does. And this is where zeroRISC comes into the picture as introduced in your materials. zeroRISC is described as a company founded by original OpenTitan team members, including its founder and CEO, Dominic Rizzo, and they are specifically focused on providing commercial cloud-based security services that are built directly on this OpenTitan open source hardware foundation.
So they're taking that transparent, trustworthy open source silicon and building commercial offerings, services around it.
Exactly. zeroRISC is leveraging OpenTitan's inherent transparency and trustworthiness to offer verifiable transparency and trust for devices deployed across diverse environments, from massive data centers and edge computing locations to vast fleets of IoT devices out in the world. They offer something called the Integrity Management Platform, or IMP.
IMP, what does that do?
This platform is described as an all-in-one solution. It covers the silicon itself, the software running on it, and the cloud services needed to manage it all securely.
Okay. And what's a key benefit of their approach, particularly for the people who own or operate these devices?
A core message highlighted is that their solution is secure by design, built on this open, verifiable hardware foundation. And crucially, the security is ultimately controlled by you, the device owner or operator. Their approach effectively decouples the device's fundamental security from its place of manufacture or its initial supply chain.
How
It allows security policies and verification to be managed and scaled with software from the cloud, rather than relying solely on physical possession or needing constant on-site diligence. This allows device consumers, the people using the devices, to define and enforce security policies that meet their specific needs, rather than being locked into controls defined solely by, say, the operating system developers or the original hardware manufacturers. It shifts control.
And where do they focus their security efforts within the system stack? Is it software or hardware?
zeroRISC's approach, as detailed in the materials, focuses on starting security below the traditional operating system layer. This is significant because sophisticated attacks often target the underlying hardware and firmware, which operate beneath the OS and are much harder to inspect or secure with traditional software-level defenses.
Right, the deeper layers.
Exactly. By leveraging OpenTitan, they forward what they call immutable trust, starting directly from the hardware layer and extending it up through the software stack. This aims to secure the entire chain, all the way from the factory floor where the chip is first programmed to the device operating out in the field, providing robust protection against hardware vulnerabilities, firmware attacks, and software weaknesses.
This really sounds like it's trying to make the kind of advanced, verifiable device security that previously maybe only the largest tech companies could realistically achieve, making it accessible to a much broader range of companies and device owners.
That's precisely how it's framed in the materials, yes. They are seen as democratizing big tech-like device security capabilities. By building on transparent, verifiable, open hardware foundations like OpenTitan, they are moving away from these unverifiable black box security solutions towards systems where trust can be formally verified and audited by the owner.
Putting control back in the hands of the owners.
Exactly. The material even highlights that investor support for zeroRISC points to its potential not just for general trustworthy supply chain security and hardware, but also for potentially combating emerging issues like AI deepfakes through verifiable end-to-end attestation that's anchored in secure hardware. Interesting application.
And they recently had some significant funding success, suggesting market confidence in this whole model.
Yes. The reports you included mention that zeroRISC recently closed an oversubscribed $10 million seed funding round. That brought their total funding up to $15 million. That level of investment is certainly strong evidence of market validation for their approach, building commercial, verifiable security services on top of open source silicon.
Okay, wow, we've covered a lot of ground here. From the physical supply chain, forced labor concerns, compliance, detentions, all the way down to the digital design supply chain, secure silicon, open source hardware, and companies like zeroRISC. How do we bring these two seemingly quite different areas together? What's the connecting thread?
Well, this brings us really to the final section, tying it all together based on the materials you shared. We've explored that intense regulatory focus and pressure on preventing forced labor and human trafficking in physical goods supply chains. We looked at the detailed compliance steps companies need to take to manage those risks and the process of handling potential detentions under laws like UFLPA.
Right, the physical side.
Then we delved into the crucial importance of verifiable trust at the fundamental silicon level. Looking at OpenTitan as a transparent open hardware foundation and zeroRISC building commercial services on that foundation to provide verifiable trust and control for device owners, the digital side.
The overarching theme that connects these areas, it really feels like it's all about ensuring integrity and taking proactive responsibility in these incredibly complex, multi-layered systems. Whether those layers are physical materials and labor or digital designs and code.
Exactly. That's the core message. The materials reinforce that supply chain integrity today is deeply multifaceted. It's under intense scrutiny from regulators, yes, but also from investors, consumers, business partners. And navigating this environment successfully requires companies, and ultimately device owners too, to take proactive, comprehensive responsibility, to ensure transparency and diligence are applied at every single stage. From the human labor involved in extracting raw materials and assembling goods, all the way through to the complex digital design and final deployment of the chips and technology that power our world. It's end-to-end responsibility.
And why does understanding all of this matter to you, our listener? How can you apply these insights from the materials provided?
Well, whether you're directly involved in importing goods as part of a business, or maybe manufacturing products that incorporate global components, or perhaps working with or deploying complex electronics and connected devices, or even just as someone who relies on countless pieces of technology every single day, this knowledge is incredibly valuable. Understanding these different layers of risk, the human rights risks, the legal and regulatory risks, the technical security risks embedded deep in the hardware, and appreciating the significant efforts being made to build verifiable trust at every level. It helps you navigate this increasingly complex global landscape much more effectively. It's about moving from a state of potential uncertainty about the origins and trustworthiness of the goods and technology we interact with daily towards a state of greater assurance and verifiable integrity.
So it gives you a more complete picture of both the challenges, which are significant, and also the innovative solutions that are emerging to address them.
Precisely. It's truly been a deep dive into the often hidden complexities of modern commerce and technology supply chains, based entirely on what you shared with us.
Okay. As we wrap up this deep dive, here is a final provocative thought for you, our listener, to consider, drawing from everything we've discussed. As supply chains become ever more complex, ever more global, relying on countless tiers of suppliers and highly specialized components, can we truly achieve genuine trust in the products and technology we use without demanding and being able to verify complete transparency at every single level?
Yeah.
From the human labor involved in producing the raw materials, right down to the specific lines of code and the intricate hardware designs embedded in the smallest, most foundational chips, is total, verifiable transparency the only real path to trust?
It raises a really fundamental question, doesn't it, about how we define and actually verify trust in our increasingly interconnected and often opaque world. Something to mull over.
That brings us to the end of this deep dive. Thank you so much for joining us on this exploration and, of course, for providing the materials that made this entire analysis possible.
We certainly hope you found these insights valuable and maybe even applicable to your own context.
And finally, just one more reminder. This deep dive today was brought to you by Stonefly. They're leaders in enterprise storage, backup, and disaster recovery, AI storage, and cloud solutions.
That's right. And if you're looking for secure, ransomware-proof storage, remember Stonefly sells air-gapped and immutable storage. Top-notch security.
Absolutely. You can contact them directly at sales@stonefly.com to schedule a demo.
Until next time.
See you on the next deep dive.